The submersible's lights cut through the darkness at 5,000 feet below the surface. Captain Marvin McCamus was running routine tests in the tongue of the ocean when he saw it. What looked like a stray cable started moving on its own. Then it turned, and two eyes locked onto his through the porthole. A creature from the age of the dinosaurs, alive and watching him from the abyss. And that story is just one of the many cryptids we'll be covering found in the Bermuda Triangle. But before we begin, if you love cryptids and want to learn the full story, both the legends and the facts, then this guided tour is for you. Dive on over and tap that subscribe, like, or review button, depending on where you watch or listen. Now, secure your diving gear and prepare your compass. The tour is about to start. I'm Cody, and you're touring cryptids across the Atlas. You know, when people talk about the Bermuda Triangle, they usually go straight to the disappearing planes and ships. Maybe throw in some theories about magnetic anomalies or alien abductions. But what if I told you that some of the most terrifying encounters in this mysterious patch of ocean have nothing to do with missing vessels at all? What if the real danger comes from what's living beneath those waves? And for those who might not know, we're talking about the infamous stretch of ocean between Bermuda, Miami, and Puerto Rico. About 500,000 square miles of the Atlantic that swallowed hundreds of ships and planes over the years. But the Triangle has been collecting monster stories for centuries too. And these aren't just vague sailors' tales. We've got naval officers, submarine pilots, and experienced fishermen all describing creatures that science says shouldn't exist. Giant octopi that can pull down entire boats, sea serpents rising 30 feet out of the water, and that plesiosaur encounter from 1965? Yeah, we're going to be getting to that one for sure. But let's start with what might be the Triangle's signature cryptid, the Lusca. Now, if you ask any old-timer in the Bahamas about what lurks in those blue holes, they'll tell you about the Lusca. Half octopus, half shark, all nightmare. But first, let me explain what a blue hole is, because these things are terrifying even without monsters in them. Picture a perfectly round hole in shallow tropical waters. From above, it looks like a deep blue eye staring up at you from the sea floor. These are basically underwater sinkholes that can drop hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet straight down. The Bahamas has more of them than anywhere else on Earth, and they connect to vast underwater cave systems that wind through the limestone bedrock. And most of these have never even been fully explored because, well, underwater cave diving is already really dangerous. And the locals, they have good reason to fear these blue holes. In 2009, a fisherman named Rupert Timer had an encounter that still gives him chills. Now, Timer's not some tourist who saw a weird shadow. He spent his whole life on these waters. He knows what belongs and what doesn't. He was out fishing off Andros Island, that's the large island in the Bahamas, by the way, when he spotted what he thought was a whale shark. Makes sense, right? Whale sharks are common in these warm waters. But as his boat drifted closer, the thing revealed itself to be something else entirely. Timer described it as having the head of a shark, specifically a mako shark, with, the pointed snout, but then it had these tentacles trailing behind it. The part he could see of the creature was about 8 feet long, but he knew that there was more underneath it. When interviewed years later in 2016 on River Monsters, Timer's story hadn't changed a bit. He said, "I'll always remember that until the day I die." But Timer's not alone in what he saw. That same year, a local diver named Peter Douglas was exploring one of Andros's ocean blue holes when something massive emerged from the cave below him. And when I say massive, I mean massive. Douglas told Josh Gates on Destination Truth, it just came up off the bottom, murky grayish brown in color. He saw multiple tentacles rising up from the darkness. He estimated the creature to be at least 40 to 50 foot long. Now, for reference, the largest documented octopus species, the giant Pacific octopus, maxes out at around 30 feet. This thing was significantly bigger. And remember, this is coming from an experienced diver who knows what normal octopi look like. Now, you might be thinking, these are just stories. Fishermen see weird things. Divers get spooked in dark caves. We get it. But here's where things get interesting, because sometimes pieces of these creatures actually wash up on shore. In January of 2011, physical evidence literally floated onto a Grand Bahama Island beach. Locals found the partial remains of an enormous octopus, just the head and mouth parts, but even just those fragments were massive. Based on what washed up, fishermen who had been working these waters for decades estimated the full creature would have been at minimum 30 foot across. Now, the remains deteriorated before proper scientific analysis could be done, which, does sound a little convenient, but multiple witnesses saw and photographed the carcass before it rotted away. This Grand Bahama octopus is often cited as tangible evidence that giant octopi inhabit the Bermuda Triangle region. And look, even if you're skeptical, you have to admit, something that size washing up is not normal. And these octopus stories aren't new. The Triangle's been producing them for nearly 200 years. In 1836, an American ship captain claimed his vessel was attacked by a gigantic octopus in what is now known as the Bahamas. And this wasn't just a sighting. According to the captain, 2 sailors were actually pulled overboard by the creature's gigantic arms. Think about that for a second. This thing was strong enough and large enough to grab grown men off of a ship's deck. The crew managed to hack off one of the tentacles in the struggle, and this tentacle, it was reportedly 3.5 meters long. That's over 11 feet, and it was as thick as a man's body. The captain said he sent the massive tentacle to P.T. Barnum's museum in New York as proof. Now, zoologist Addison Verrill doubted this story when he heard it, but others, including cryptozoologist Bernard Heuvelmans, initially suspected it could have been a giant squid arm. The account was published by French journalist B.H. Revoil in 1863, giving us one of the first documented Kraken attacks in the Triangle. And real or not, it set the stage for everything that followed. Jump forward to 1872, and we get a more credible scientific account. J.S. George of Nassau, Bahamas, wrote to the American Naturalist Journal describing a colossal octopus found dead on a Bahamian beach. The creature's body was about 10 foot long with arms 5 foot each, weighing an estimated 200 to 300 pounds. And that was far larger than any octopus known to science at the time. The dead monster bore injuries, suggesting it might have even been larger before parts of it were lost. Maybe it had been in a fight with something even bigger, or maybe it had entangled with a ship's propeller. But as the World War II era came around, some of the most credible sightings began to crop up. Probably because you had trained military personnel making these observations. In around March or April of 1941, U.S. Navy coxswain John C. Martin was serving aboard the tanker USS Chicopee off the Florida coast, somewhere between Fort Lauderdale and St. Augustine. An entire gun crew was on deck when they spotted what initially looked like a huge pile of broken kelp floating on the surface. Naval vessels see kelp and debris all the time, so at first this was no big deal. But as they got closer, they realized this wasn't plant matter. It was a living creature with massive coiled arms. Martin described these tentacles as being looped up like huge coils of manila rope, with each coil over 36 inches thick, 3 feet thick. Let that sink in. The creature drifted near the ship before disappearing back into the depths. But what makes this sighting particularly interesting is that Martin noted the incident wasn't logged in the ship's official records. Probably because, what sane officer is going to write their encounter with a giant octopus in a military log? But Martin stood by his account for the rest of his life. He believed an unknown giant cephalopod had been disturbed from the depths. Maybe by all the naval operations happening during the war. Then there's another story from around the same era that's absolutely wild. Frank Hurricane Clark, and yes, that was his actual nickname, was becalmed about 500 miles east of the Bahamas. Now, being becalmed means your sailing ship is stuck with no wind. You're just kind of floating there. So Clark had nothing to do but watch the water. That's when he witnessed something out of his own nightmares. He saw an enormous octopus at the surface being attacked by an entire group of tiger sharks. You never saw such a thrashing and churning, he recalled. The sharks were literally tearing the octopus apart piece by piece. Clark was so frightened, he took cover below the deck until the battle ended. Now, 500 miles east puts us on the eastern fringes of the Triangle. But think about what he saw. An octopus so large that multiple tiger sharks were feeding on it, like lions on a zebra? That's not a normal encounter with an octopus and a shark, but the story reinforced the notion that huge cephalopods lurk in the Atlantic depths. occasionally coming to the surface where they become prey for other predators. But if we roll the dates back a little bit further, around 1925, there was an incident off Andros Island that locals still talked about decades later. Forrest Wood, a researcher, collected this story in 1956 from an island commissioner who'd experienced it as a boy. Now, picture this. A 12-year-old kid out fishing with his father in about 600 feet of water. And that's when something huge grabbed their line, looking over the side. And remember, Bahamian water is crystal clear, you can see a long way down. They saw this large octopus clinging to the fishing line. But this wasn't just any octopus. When it latched onto the boat's bottom, it nearly pulled the entire vessel down with it. The boat started tipping and taking on water. It only released and descended after what must have felt like an eternity of fighting at the line and kicking at its tentacles. The locals deemed this an encounter with a giant scuttle, that's their term for octopus, and it gave credence to the Lusca legend that was already well established in the Bahamian folklore. But this wasn't some ancient legend. This was a government official telling a researcher about something that happened in his own childhood. But the triangle doesn't just have tentacled monsters. It's got reptilian ones too. And the next encounter is probably the most famous and most credible cryptid sighting in the entire Bermuda Triangle. July 1965, the DSV Alvin, which, by the way, is the same submersible that later explored the Titanic, was conducting test dives in the tongue of the ocean. Now, the tongue of the ocean is this deep ocean trench that runs along the eastern edge of Andros Island in the Bahamas. It's basically an underwater canyon that drops from shallow reefs straight down to over 6,000 feet. The Navy uses it for submarine testing because it's so deep and so close to shore. Crystal clear water, straight walls, and minimal current. Perfect for testing deep sea equipment. Captain Marvin McCamus was piloting Alvin that day, along with engineer Bill Rainey. They were conducting a routine deep sea test dive when things got a little weird. At about 5,000 feet down, actually, the records say 5,300 feet to be exact, McCamus spotted what he first thought was a stray cable or pole hanging in the water. Now, equipment debris isn't that unusual at a Navy test site, but then the cable started to move on its own. When he swung the sub around to point its lights at it, McCamus saw a creature 40 to 50 foot long with a thick body, 2 sets of flippers, and a long neck, ending in what he called a snake-like head with 2 eyes looking right at us. The description, dead ringer for a plesiosaur. You know, those long-necked marine reptiles that supposedly went extinct 66 million years ago. The startled creature fled upward with powerful strokes of its flippers, and McCamus tried to maneuver Alvin for a photograph, but the creature was already beyond the camera's range, disappearing into the dark water above them. And here's where the story gets really interesting, and a bit frustrating if you're a believer, because when McCamus and Rainey surfaced and reported the encounter back to the support ship, the crew met them with total skepticism. The Navy actually removed the mention from Alvin's official dive log. They thought McCamus was making it all up, maybe suffering from nitrogen narcosis or just seeing things in the darkness. But here's the thing, McCamus was a veteran pilot with an impeccable record. This wasn't some rookie who got spooked by a fish. He later gave his first-hand description to Charles Berlitz, who published it in his 1977 book, Without a Trace. McCamus reaffirmed the sighting in interviews throughout the 1990s. He never changed his story. Nowadays, cryptozoologists refer to this animal as the Alvin plesiosaur, a possible living fossil marine reptile. McCamus insisted until his dying day that the sighting was real, and it remains one of the most compelling deep ocean cryptid encounters on record. I mean, when you do have credible witnesses in a government submersible with other witnesses around watching it go down at a very specific location and depth, that's about as good a cryptid sighting as you can hope for. But just because it might be one of the most famous doesn't mean that's the only sea serpent ever seen in the Triangle. Sea serpent sightings in the Bermuda Triangle go way back, and I'm talking about all the way to Columbus himself. On January 9th, 1493, while sailing near present-day Haiti, which sits right on the southern edge of what we now call the Bermuda Triangle, Columbus and his crew observed three mermaid-like creatures rising from the sea. Now, Columbus had been at sea for months, and you'd think he'd be ready to see mermaids everywhere. But what's funny is Columbus, ever the realist, noted in his log that these mermaids weren't nearly as pretty as they are depicted, for somehow in the face they looked like men. Now we know he was almost certainly looking at manatees. But hey, 5 months at sea, scurvy setting in, rations running low, I'd probably see mermaids too. But still, this is actually one of the earliest cryptid reports from the Triangle region. Even if it has a boring explanation, it shows that these waters have been producing monster sightings since Europeans first arrived. But fast forward to January 22nd of 1860, and something massive washed ashore in Hungary Bay on Bermuda itself. You know, the actual island that gives the Bermuda Triangle its name. Harper's Weekly, which was like the Time magazine of its day, ran an illustration in their March 3rd issue. They called it a great sea serpent, and the illustration shows this long serpentine creature laid out on the beach with people standing next to it for scale. Contemporary reports described it as over 10 meters long, or 30 feet, with what looked like a mane-like fin running down its back. Scientists now think it was probably an oarfish. Oarfish are these ribbon-like silver fish that normally live in deep water, but they do occasionally surface and wash ashore. And in 1860, nobody knew what an oarfish even was, so this carcass was treated as evidence of a legitimate sea serpent in Bermuda, and might account for at least some of the actual sightings. The find left a strong impression in early cryptozoology circles, and added to the growing legend that these waters harbored monsters. But the sea serpent sightings didn't stop in the 1800s. They continued right into the modern era. In 1964, the crew of an unmanned freighter reported seeing a massive serpentine creature near the Bahamas. According to regional lore, this wasn't a glimpse of something in the water, but rather a long snake-like beast that actually breached the surface, towering an estimated 30 feet in the air, before diving back down into the depths. The entire startled crew witnessed it, though no physical evidence, of course, was recovered. And around that same time, in the 60s, local fishermen were telling tales about encounters with colossal eels or long eel-like beasts in these waters. Now, were they seeing an oarfish? Maybe a giant eel? Something else? We don't know. But these accounts, even if they were just anecdotal, contributed to the Triangle's reputation as an area where sea serpents might still roam. But our next bit of info doesn't quite fit in the monster category at all. But I figured we'd share because it definitely belongs in the collection of the Triangle's weird and unexplained. And it does tie into cryptids a little bit, so bear with me. On December 7th, 1970, pilot Bruce Gernon took off from Andros Island in the Bahamas in a Beechcraft Bonanza with 2 passengers heading for Florida. This should have been a routine flight. It's only about 150 miles from Andros to Miami. At 4,000 feet altitude, good weather, clear skies, what could go wrong? Well, Gernon first noticed a strange cloud that kept growing in size. Not spreading out like a normal cloud, but actually like growing and building on itself. Then somehow he found himself entering what he described as a tunnel-shaped vortex of clouds. Picture flying through a horizontal tornado, clouds spinning around you in a perfect tube with flashing white lights throughout. Inside this tunnel, everything went haywire. His compass started spinning counterclockwise. All his electronic navigation equipment malfunctioned. Gernon said it felt like the plane was being operated by something else. He couldn't control his heading, couldn't trust his instruments, and he could barely see. But when he finally emerged from the vortex, Gernon got the shock of his life because he was already over Miami. A flight that normally took 75 to 90 minutes had been completed in just 47. He had somehow jumped over 100 miles in a fraction of the time it should have taken. So let's put that into perspective. His Beechcraft Bonanza had a cruising speed of about 175 miles per hour. To cover the distance he covered in that time, he would have needed to be flying at over 300 miles per hour. That's physically impossible for that aircraft. Oh, and the plane had used less fuel than it should have for a normal flight of this length. Now, Gernon, of course, survived to tell the tale, and his story has been publicized in the book The Fog and featured in countless documentaries. He proposed that an unexplained natural phenomenon exists in the Triangle, maybe an electromagnetic field that can create time distortions or space warps. And here's where that ties to cryptids, Because have you heard of ultra-terrestrials? There's a growing theory that cryptid creatures aren't of our dimension, at least not all the time, that these creatures can actually shift from the fourth dimension and cross over our plane, and these glimpses we get of them are just them passing through on their way to another dimension. Did Gernon find himself in one of those exact wormholes that a cryptid might use to navigate from one plane to another? Now, it's a stretch, but it does kind of operate on that same theory, so maybe. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. Tons of sea serpents, monsters from the deep, strange blue holes, and even atmospheric phenomena that borders on the impossible. But don't think that the strange is limited to the ocean only, because the locals to the Bahamas have their own stories of lake monsters that go back generations. On Cat Island, which, fun fact, is supposedly where Columbus first made landfall in the New World, there's a peculiar mangrove lake that nobody's willing to go near. The fear of this lake goes back decades, and locals have long called it home to a man-eating monster. In 1997, writer Randy Wayne White visited Cat Island to investigate these stories. He met an elderly local named Gator Ishmael, who told him what happened back to him in the 50s. According to Ishmael, his family had a horse die, so they dragged the carcass to the lake to dispose of it. To them it made sense, let nature take care of it. Right? Wrong. Within moments of the horse hitting the water, a large wake formed. Something surged up from below, grabbed the entire horse carcass, and dragged it under in a moment. And we're talking about a full-grown horse, 1,000 pounds of dead weight, just yanked beneath the surface and gone. Locals have different theories about what lives in that lake. Some call it a mermaid, though not the kind you'd be familiar with. Others believe it's a giant octopus that came up through those underwater caves we talked about earlier. See, many of these inland lakes in the Bahamas connect to the ocean through those same limestone caverns. You can even watch the tide change in these lakes even though they're inland. So theoretically, something could swim up from the ocean and make its home in these isolated bodies of water. The story made enough waves that the Sun Sentinel, a major Fort Lauderdale newspaper, picked it up in 1997. They reported on these local rumors of a monster in the mangrove swamp lake, suggesting the creature could be a giant octopus preying on livestock that wandered too close. The coverage brought regional folklore, particularly the Lusca legend, to wider attention, and suddenly, people outside the Bahamas were learning what island locals had known about for generations: stay away from certain waters. But you know what's really interesting about all these encounters? The consistency. Whether it's 1836 or 2011, witnesses described the same types of creatures. Giant octopi with tentacles thick as tree trunks, serpentine creatures rising from the depths, reptilian beasts that look like they crawled out of the Mesozoic era. And that consistency either means there's something to these stories, or that humans are really good at telling the same lies for 200 years. But by the 21st century, television crews started taking these stories more seriously, enough to mount their own expeditions. In 2009, Sci-Fi's Destination Truth, led by Josh Gates, went to Andros specifically to investigate the Lusca sightings. They interviewed witnesses, dove in blue holes, set up underwater cameras, the works. And while the team didn't capture the Lusca on camera, because of course they didn't, that'd be too easy, they did record something interesting. Massive, unexplained splashes in a blue hole at night. Something big was moving down there, and it wasn't happy about the intrusion. The sound was loud enough to be picked up clearly on the equipment from the surface. And the investigations keep coming. Monster Quest has covered the Lusca. River Monsters featured it. Each expedition adds another piece to the puzzle. Another witness account, another unexplained sonar reading, another mysterious splash in the darkness. And of course, they've yet to find definitive proof, because if they had, it wouldn't be on the show, but they keep finding things they can't explain. And this is the thing that should give us all a bit of a pause. Because we know the ocean is full of surprises. The giant squid was considered a complete myth, a sailor's tale if you will, until 2004 when Japanese researchers finally got footage of a living one. For centuries, people found beaks in whale stomachs, sucker marks on skin, but science said, nope, doesn't exist. Then boom, there it is on camera, real as day. And of course, our buddy the coelacanth was supposed to be extinct for 66 million years. It was a fossil, that is, until 1938, when fishermen off South Africa pulled one up in their nets, very much alive, leaving science to rewrite their textbooks. If these creatures can hide from science for so long, what else could be down there? And the Bermuda Triangle sits above some seriously deep water. The tongue of the ocean where McCamus saw this plesiosaur, like we said, is over 6,000 feet deep. The Puerto Rico Trench on the southern edge of the triangle plunges to over 27,000 feet deep. That's deeper than Mount Everest is tall. The Milwaukee Deep, the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, is right there in the triangle. It's likely that many early sailors' reports of leviathans were inspired by glimpses of real animals we now know to exist. Giant squids, oarfish, whale sharks, a 30-foot oarfish breaking the surface in the moonlight, that's gonna look like a sea serpent. But nevertheless, the notion persists that perhaps something even larger or more mysterious remains undiscovered, still in the triangle's abyss. And each sighting, each carcass, each credible witness keeps that question open. Believers will tell you that these creatures are remnants from another age, survivors hiding in the deep places of the earth. Skeptics say it's misidentification, same old, just seen in a different light. But when you have all these people seeing so many of the same thing, you have to wonder. And most of them are professionals, people who aren't prone to fantasy. Now, modern science acknowledges that creatures like the giant squid do actually inhabit Atlantic waters, including the Sargasso Sea in the Caribbean. And the ocean depths between Bermuda, Florida, and Puerto Rico remain largely unexplored. We've mapped more of Mars than we have of our own ocean floor. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the deep trenches of the Bermuda Triangle. So maybe the Bermuda Triangle's real mystery isn't about disappearing ships and planes. Maybe it's about what's living in those waters, watching from below, occasionally surfacing just long enough to remind us that we don't know nearly as much about our oceans as we think we do. So the next time you're out on a boat in those waters, maybe keep an eye on what's beneath the surface, because according to hundreds of witnesses over hundreds of years, there's something down there, something big and that shouldn't exist, but apparently it does. Thank you for touring cryptids across the Atlas. And remember to keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see just on the edge of the road.